Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be with you today with our speakers for the third session of the cycle of conferences organized under the Brussels International College. It's organized by the Belgian Royal Academy in partnership with the External Action Service and under the patronage of the High Representative Vice-Président Josep Borrell. Today, we have a session dedicated under the title of Towards a Common European Strategic Culture. One could not imagine a more topical subject considering the very fraught strategic environments in which we live in, whether you turn east or far east or south, every direction, big strategic stake out there, and simply raise the question of the strategic relevance of the EU on whether we are a player or simply a theater where others play out. We have today with us two eminent speakers, and I'm really glad that we have Professor Karen Smith with us. She will make the presentation on this topic. She's a professor of international relations and head of the Department of International Relations at the London School of Economic and Political Science. Main area of research is the international relations of the European Union. She wrote abundantly on the formulation and implementation of common EU foreign policies. So she's well placed to address today's topic. I noted that one of your recent publications was on emotions and EU foreign policy, and for sure there is a lot of emotions these days. So it would be interesting to hear you also in that respect. Then turning to Giovanni Grevi, who is a visiting professor at the College of Europe and the Brussels School of Governance, and also at the Paris School of International Affairs. Giovanni has an eminent experience and stayed in various think tanks until recently as a senior associate fellow at the European Policy Centers, but also in other think tanks in the past. And he also wrote abundantly in his last publications on European strategic autonomy, strategic sovereignty. So he's also very well placed to address today's topic. So as I said, it's a very particular junctures and today, and that really we question the ability for the EU to get its act together, to have some weight on the conduct of global affairs. So do we have enough diligence in terms of building a common strategic culture in being able to, I would say, contribute and strengthen it at the three levels? First, our common capacity to develop a common strategic analysis, our capacity to come to our capacity of decision together. And the third level is, of course, our capacity to act together, which raised indeed the question of our toolbox and instruments. So there are three levels that we could possibly address today in the context of the presentations and the Q&A. For the Q&A, please, when you put your question, introduce yourself and indicate to whom you would like to direct the question. We will take the questions by a series of 2, 3, and so we will have several rounds. We have altogether 1.5 hours, so I don't want to drag on, and I will immediately invite Karen to make a presentation for I think about 20-25 minutes or so, and then Giovanni as a respondent for 10-15 minutes, and then we will move to the Q&A. So that's it for me by way of introduction. And when we will wrap up, I will also give some indications for the next sessions of this cycle of conferences. Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hervé. So I I guess you could put the first slide on. Yeah, great. So I'm going to talk about the difficult emergence of an EU common strategic culture, and in particular, internal diversity, varying threat perceptions and their security and foreign policy implications, with the question, which way to further integration, if there's any way at all, I suppose one could say. So the outline that of my, so you could put the next slide on. The next. Great, thanks. I'm first going to talk about what was a kind of a theory introduced by Stanley Hoffmann over 50 years ago, the logic of diversity. So I want to talk about the logic of diversity and EU foreign policy making. Then I want to talk about institutional reform and the logic of diversity. And then finally, possible ways forward in terms of dealing with the logic of diversity. My main argument is going to be that to try to handle the implications of the logic of diversity, member states need to be better integrated into the policymaking process, and this should be institutionalized. So next slide, please. So the logic of diversity comes from an article written by Stanley Hoffmann in 1966. He was effectively in this article responding to neo-functionalist theories. And neo-functionalist, of course, posited that integration would eventually kind of spill over, and they didn't say this quite outright, but effectively the understanding was that this integration would go on and spill over into, I disappeared for a minute there, sorry, would spill over into something like a United States of Europe. In other words, you would get effectively the replacement of the nation states at that level with something larger, with something much more supranational. And Stanley Hoffmann then wrote that this is actually not what is going to happen. And so in 1966, he argued that it was clear that the nation state was not obsolete. Of course, at the time that this was published, this was sort of a full Gaullist moment in Europe, and with all the implications that had for the European community and indeed NATO. But Hoffmann's argument was that it's clear that the nation state is not obsolete and is not going to disappear anytime soon. And he provided 3 reasons why we're not going to see the political unification of Western Europe, why it had not succeeded thus far. The first was that there was this logic of diversity. And this is a diversity of domestic determinants, geohistorical situations, and outside aims among the units in any international system. So in this particular case, within Western Europe. Those units will be continued to be nation states rather than larger blocs like the European community, because of the legitimacy of the principle of national self-determination and the deep appeal of nationalism. What that meant, for Hoffmann argued, was that you weren't going to have a unification of states through some process of national self-abdication. So nation states weren't willingly going to give up sovereignty and suddenly put themselves into this larger bloc and disappear because of that diversity of domestic determinants, geohistorical. Of mutual assured destruction paradoxically meant that you wouldn't have territorial agglomeration, so you wouldn't have a larger unit appear through the use of force. So it wasn't as though some outside power or one of the inside powers within Europe was going to be able to unify the states by force. So therefore, he argued, you were not going to see a political unity. Can I go to the next slide? Thank you. So now, over 50 years later, what is the situation? So in 2022. So despite half a century of regional institution building in the foreign policy field, which is all very impressive, the diversity of domestic determinants, geohistorical situations, and outside aims of the European Union's member states is still apparent. We can still very much see a logic of diversity. And arguably, we could even say that nationalism is a stronger force today for a variety of reasons, including the fact that you've got many newly independent, well, relatively speaking, newly independent states within the EU and so on and so forth. So member states do not appear to have a common conception of fundamental external threats to the EU. I mean, Hervé was sort of alluding to this in his introductory remarks. So there doesn't seem to be too much agreement on how to deal with fundamental external threats to the EU, or even if they are fundamental external threats to the EU. And there has even been disagreement on core foreign policy values. And we can see the implications for foreign policy making of this logic of diversity in the increasing use of vetoes and an increasing trend to what I'm going to call lowest common denominator outcomes. And so if you could just put the next slide on. What is in this slide is this is not the full list, but this is just a sample list of the recent use of vetoes in the foreign policy making process. And this is just gathered from public news sources, of course. And I think, so you've got, I'm not going to read them out, but I think the key thing to take away from this is that it is not only one or two particular member states. I mean, Hungary does appear on that list quite a bit, but it is not the only state that has exercised this kind of blocking power. And these vetoes have been wielded in a wide variety of areas, from on sanctions in particular, but also just on rather kind of you could argue anodyne declarations. So there seems to be blocking behavior across what the European Union foreign policy machinery is discussing, but also by a variety of states and not just the same one or two, even if the same one or two may be more frequent vetoers than other member states. So there's clearly an issue here. Recent academic literature has investigated this kind of this blocking behavior, this changing in the norms, the resistance to cooperation norms at the EU level. And it is clear that this is categorically different from some of the blocking behavior that we have seen in the past. In other words, diplomats are telling academics, at least, or officials are telling academics, that we see the blocking behavior that we see today is categorically different to the kind of blocking behavior that we saw in the past. First of all, it's much more frequent. And secondly, it doesn't seem to be only on the basis of vital national interests. In other words, there seems to be blocking behavior simply for the sake of blocking behavior. So just being difficult, in other words, is what's coming up in the academic literature. Next slide, please. And so another way that we can see the way that the logic of diversity is sort of having an impact on EU foreign policy making outcomes is through what we can call lowest common denominator outcomes. And that means lowest common denominator means that any agreement that comes out between the member states is essentially what the most resistant or most reluctant member state indicates, right? So all of the preferences have to collapse down to the lowest common denominator, which is what the most resistant state or group of states will put up with. And so there's just a few here again. This all comes from a European Commission report, which was calling for the increased use of qualified majority voting in foreign policy making from 2018. And these are all examples of this tendency for a lowest common denominator. In other words, one member state says, I'm not going to agree to this particular outcome until you do something. And then they've set the low standard. They set the floor, and you can't go below that particular, you can't go above that particular floor. So this, again, I'm not going to just read this out, but this is an indication, again, that we see a distinct impact of the logic of diversity on foreign policy outcomes at the European Union level. So next slide, please. Okay, so why are we, what's happening? Why do we see this now, in, over the past 5 to 10 years? Now, there are many reasons why the situation appears to be worse, why those academics that are writing on things like de-Europeanization and so on are arguing that the situation is worse. Why? Well, we've got rising illiberalism and right-wing populism, and we've seen that for at least the past decade. Of course, it's not a unique, not only in this particular period that we have seen that, certainly we've seen quite a bit of it within. So that's, in other words, there are more states that are more difficult within the European Union. The second reason is that the United States is not so engaged in this process. And I'm not going to completely go into the history of all of this literature or history, but one could say that, I mean, there is a strong argument to say that one of the reasons why you could have European integration in the first place is that you had both US protection, that is the nuclear guarantee. So Europe was secure, Western Europe was secure, and so they could cooperate with each other. And secondly, the US was actively pushing the European states to cooperate with each other, particularly in the first 2 decades after World War II. Post-Cold War, post sort of financial crisis, Trump, et cetera, the United States does not appear to be so engaged. And so that might be, in that kind of a context, without this strong external unifier, the logic of diversity may just play out in the ways that we have just seen. The third reason why is that we've got more member states. So enlargement has obviously brought in more member states, and that means more so-called veto points. So more veto players are in the game, and therefore you will see more blocking behavior. But I would argue that there's also a link to increased institutionalization with the Lisbon Treaty. The two have gone hand in hand. And what the Lisbon Treaty did, somewhat, I mean, it is, when you kind of look at the whole history, it is unique what the Lisbon Treaty did in the field of foreign policy, and not necessarily elsewhere. In that the Lisbon Treaty provisions reduced the role for member states in EU foreign policy making. And I would argue that this reduced the sense of ownership of EU foreign policy making, the process, the outcomes among member states. It reduced a sense of responsibility by the member states for ensuring that the process works, for ensuring that there are outcomes that are acceptable to all. And it reduced the feeling of inclusion in the policymaking process. So next slide, please. So institutionalization and resistance to institutionalization arguably go hand in hand. In other words, the more there's some sort of centralizing process, the more the member states have agreed to, of course, but the more that there's that centralizing process, the more the member states are actually resisting it. So there's this sort of back and forth between these two phenomenon. And the CFSP in general, according to Simon Nuttall, who of course observed these European political cooperation and the beginning of CFSP at first hand, I mean, he argued that the introduction of CFSP, so its the replacement of European political cooperation with the Maastricht Treaty, did reduce socialization amongst national diplomats. He was already noticing this, that European political cooperation was a much cozier affair. Of course, there were fewer member states at the time, in which there were nice opportunities for diplomats to socialize with each other. And they did so in the capital of the presidency, and sort of presidencies made it successive presidencies kind of made it a point of honor to put on a good show for the diplomats, and, a palazzo there, a and that had been replaced by a much more bureaucratic process that was based in Brussels. And so some of that kind of those opportunities for socialization had disappeared. And so Nuttall was already quite pessimistic in terms of predicting what that reduced socialization might do for the foreign policymaking process. The Lisbon Treaty then has arguably revolutionized EU foreign policy making even more than CFSP did. And it quite radically reduced the role of member states in the process in favor of even more Brusselization. So there's the European External Action Service, there's a much stronger kind of different role for the High Representative, and so on. And one thing I would argue is that the elimination of the role of the presidency in foreign policy is notable and potentially far-reaching. Now, there is plenty of research out there that was done before the Lisbon Treaty on the value of the presidency as perceived by member states. In other words, member states, and particularly smaller member states, took the presidency very seriously. They valued what it gave to them. They had a chance, the presidency allowed them a chance to lead, a chance to influence the agenda, and a chance to speak for the European Union. And that is gone now. That has been replaced by the High Representative and External Action Service in terms of committees below the level of the Foreign Affairs Council. And I think that's quite a radical revolutionary change that has fundamentally altered the link between the national level and the European level in the field of foreign policy making. So next slide, please. So this kind of not quite disintegration, but this certainly this loosening of the links between the national level and the European level solely in the area of foreign policy, I think is something that we need to look at when thinking about, how might, if it can be, how might the logic of diversity be overcome? And so I would say that if we agree there is an issue regarding the involvement of member states in the foreign policy making process, that is, if we think that it is problematic that link between the national level and the European level has been loosened, weakened, then the way forward is to boost the involvement of member states, and I would say institutionalize the involvement of member states. In other words, not to rely on informal ways of including the member states, because I think informal ways of including the member states would mean that there would be doubts about whether this member states were being involved equally on the same basis and so on and so forth. So I would say I would posit that therefore there needs to be an equality of opportunity for involvement and equality of responsibility. And that has to be done by somehow institutionalizing the role of member states, of a new and improved role, strengthened role of member states in the foreign policy making process. So with that in mind then, when I consider, for example, the proposals for introducing qualified majority voting to a very limited extent, but introducing qualified majority voting in foreign policy making, what I see then is even further reduction of member state involvement in the foreign policy making process, and the potential to bolster the resentment of member states against the European Union. In my view, qualified majority voting goes the other way, doesn't increase the role of the member states in the foreign policy making process. And I think in particular, one has to bear in mind voluntary. Member states do not have to conduct their foreign policy via the European Union. And in my own research, for example, that I have done on EU coordination at the United Nations in human rights issues, what has become apparent over the past decade is that EU member states can act outside of the European Union. They don't have to go via the European Union itself. So in other words, what you don't want to do is to create a kind of a situation in which member states feel that they cannot act within the European Union and they therefore must act. They must conduct foreign policy outside. And it seems to me that a proposal such as qualified majority voting, which could simply generate resentment by states that might find themselves in a minority, that's not going the right way. That would simply make states operate even further outside of the structures of European Union foreign policy cooperation. So on those grounds, then I would say one could look, for example, to involve the presidency more in some way, shape, or form. Now, I'm perhaps not bringing it back, but the presidency, of course, there is a presidency that operates in every single other area of the European Union, except for foreign policy, including in areas that are fundamental to external relations, such as climate change, trade, and so on. So there could be ways to bolster those links, but that would be a way, I think, of involving member states more and ensuring equality of opportunity and equality of responsibility. Another way would be to encourage constructive abstention, which of course is kind of an updated version of what used to be called the footnote policy during EPC, that member states who were unhappy with particular bits of a declaration or a decision can simply opt out without blocking it. But constructive abstention has only been used once, actually, since it was introduced in the 1990s, which seems to indicate that it's hard for member states to kind of have the trust, I suppose, to abstain rather than block. So I think, in sum, then a different balance between the Brussels-based architecture and national capitals may be a way out, may be a way of trying to deal with the logic of diversity, because member states are not going to voluntarily self-abdicate, as Stanley Hoffman said back in 1966. The logic of diversity is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. So some way, I think, of dealing with it without making it worse is sort of what needs to be worked on. And I would simply suggest that one has to go back to the role of the member states and how one could strengthen that role of member states in foreign policy making in a way that ensures equality of opportunity and equality of responsibility. But I will stop there and hand over to Giovanni. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karen Smith, for these brilliant presentations, which I will say would be probably counterintuitive to anyone within the Brussels bubble and thinks that actually everything that has been done since the Lisbon Treaty has been a progress and enhancing the so-called effectiveness of the CFSP, of the Common and Foreign Security Policy, very much sought after. But the purpose of these sessions is to challenge the established wisdom and trying to look at ways to do better. So I'm sure, as a respondent, Professor Gravy, Giovanni, to share your reaction to this, to the posits of Professor Smith's analysis, whether you agree, you disagree, where you would like to complement on what are the main obstacles to this common strategic culture and ability agency of the EU together in the domain of foreign security policy. Giovanni, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Hervé, for your introduction. Thanks for this invitation and this opportunity. And thank you, Karen, for an excellent and very rich paper and presentation. We deserve, of course, a much longer debate. But within the time that we have, let me point out a few issues that I think require a response and add some considerations to them. I agree on various matters. Surely the logic of diversity continues to be apparent. Surely there has been a sensible shift in the behavior of member states, some of them taking a more defiant position. yes, as you say in your paper, there is what appears to be a paradox between deeper institutionalization or even Brusselsization and further fragmentation or divergence between member states. And yes, it is important to fully wire member states in CFSP policymaking. Where I like to take a slightly different focus from that you have chosen, sort of concentrating on the institutional dimension and on the impact of the institutional reforms introduced by the Treaty of Lisbon, is by shifting a little bit this debate and zooming out from the institutional dimension per se. I think that institutions are a very important factor in enhancing potentially the convergence and unity among member states, in contributing to foster a common strategic culture, or in challenging this process, depending on how they function and how they're used. But they are not the primary factor. They are not the main factor. I think that we have to broaden a little bit the context of this debate along the lines that you also suggested, because you have pointed at a number of factors that play into this trend. And so let us look at three sets of factors. The first one, sure, it's institutional processes, bodies, and their reforms. Second, politics within member states and between member states. And third, the external context or the strategic landscape of the EU. I think that these three factors are affecting the enhancement or waning of unity and coherence among member states and of their strategic culture as well. And on top of that, I think that we can perhaps separate these factors into categories: supply side factors and demand side factors. Now, on the supply side factors, I would put institutions and national politics, because institutions and national politics coexist and cooperate in defining the offer, the supply of EU foreign policy. But then there are the demand side factors, the external environment, the trends and actors there, and the sort of challenges and threats and opportunities that they put, and therefore the demands that they put on EU foreign policy. Now, to me, the core of the matter is the conjunction between demand side factors, the external environment, and then the supply from the EU, the internal environment of EU policymaking, and more particularly the impact of the external environment on the domestic politics of EU member states and on the cooperation of EU member states. In many ways, over the last 15 years, we have seen how European integration, European political cohesion has been affected by a number of cascading crises, many of them, if not most of them, originating from outside the Union and testing the political cohesion of the Union, and in some ways contributing to normalize within member states and among member states a more explicit, overt national reflex. We had the financial crisis converting into a euro crisis. We had the destabilization of the neighborhood, south and east. We had the crisis. We had the election of President Trump and its impact on the transatlantic partnership. We had, of course, COVID. I will come back to COVID in a moment. But before COVID, it seems to me that there has been a pattern of a combination of technical fixes, difficult ones, crucial ones, but still technical fixes papering over fundamental political differences among member states, whether concerning the euro crisis or the migration crisis, for example. And alongside that, the progressive emergence and empowerment of national narratives to frame pan-European problems. Now, these crises have instilled a sense of vulnerability in European public opinion, which has, of course, created space for populist forces, calling for national solutions, sometimes unilateral decisions to take back control. And of course, detracting from the scope for compromise. And at the same time, as I said, perhaps too much timidity in facing the difficulty of a real political compromise to find structural solutions to ongoing problems. A timidity that has given more agenda-setting narrative power to populists. So this, I think, is, in my view, the larger context and the root cause of that paradox that you have Karen, between, for one, deeper institutionalization, for another, more divergence and more fragmentation. I think that this is an instance of a larger trend that has featured in EU politics in the last 15 years, up until recently at least, a trend of a mismatch between some technical solutions and political problems that fundamentally remain unaddressed. And once again, therefore, create space and agenda-setting power for sort of Eurosceptic forces, populist forces, and so on and so forth. So if we look at the implementation of the Treaty of Lisbon and the impact that it had on convergence or divergence among member states, if we look at the more or less the EU level and the national level, and also within the national level among member states, I think that it is very important to situate the history and experience of Lisbon implementation across the board, and insofar as CFSP is concerned as well, in this very specific, one may say, unprecedented political context, external and internal to the Union. Challenges of a different order of magnitude, challenges that have often been regarded and have been, in the case, at the very least, of the Euro crisis, of an existential nature, challenges that have carried direct costs, direct effects for Europe's citizens, and therefore acquired a strong presence and visibility in national political states, contributing therefore to contestation, to politicization, so on and so forth. Now, at the same time, and I am moving towards coming back to the institutional dossier, if you like, at the same time, I think that something has been changing since the COVID impacted the EU. And COVID in some ways can be seen as the trigger of this change, which has manifested primarily through the decision last year about the Next Generation EU instrument, which is essentially a massive effort to truly put resources for the common good in the face of a shock that could have otherwise proved, once again, existential for the EU and continues to be, of course, extremely difficult to manage together. But nevertheless, there was, I think, a step change. It is too soon to tell whether that is a structural shift or it is more contingent. It is too soon, I believe, to say whether this is a sort of inflection point, reversing the sort of drift towards more divergence that you were alluding to with more convergence. But I think that there is at least a different context, a shift in the discourse has taken place in the last 2 or 3 years in ways that it would have been, I think, difficult for many of us to anticipate once again up to 2 or 3 years ago. I think that there is a different sense of awareness, not only in Brussels, but also across member states, including among national publics, for the fact that faced with existential challenges, an effective response is oftentimes, at least in part, a joint response, requiring a joint assessment. There is I think, you were referring to this word responsibility at the end of your presentation. I think that there is a stronger narrative of shared responsibility. And once again, not only top down, but also bottom up. It has been on the rise. And in parallel to that, when it comes to Europe in the world, I think that there is a growing recognition that the strategic environment where we are requires Europeans to define their purpose, their priorities in a sharper way, to confront an international environment as it is and not necessarily as we wish it to be, to strengthen Europe's power base to pursue these objectives, and to do so in cooperation with others whenever possible, but also by lessening progressively the degree of dependence on others. Now, whether one calls this European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, capacity to act, is an important debate. It is, of course, as well controversial. But I think that this basic diagnosis of the need to join forces to face turmoil, to face challengers and challenges, is certainly much more present, is much more there than it has been. So perhaps we are also looking at some glimpses of an evolution in Europe's strategic culture towards equipping, enabling the Union to be more resilient and more responsive to these sort of challenges. All of this, again, as I said, inevitably remains controversial. It will require countless balancing acts. It will face reversals. If we think of it, it is not entirely surprising, considering the gravity of the international agenda as we see playing out, as we see unfolding, and the difficulties of policymaking with 27 countries and a complex institutional setting. So it's not entirely surprising that this is difficult, takes time, and it is not a linear trend. There are many sort of setbacks. And yet, once again, it seems to me in the last 3 years or so, there has been a shift in the discourse, a shift of awareness, which has also resulted in some policy agendas actually evolving from the trade field to the industrial field, technology, and security and defense, and so on and so forth. Now, it may be that this shift also provides a slightly more enabling environment to maximize the potential of cooperation through institutions and the potential of institutional reform that you were referring to. So after having zoomed out, I zoomed back in the institutional debate per se, and I think that there are two questions here, just within 3 or 4 minutes. The first one is how to foster convergence among member states, and the second one is what to do if consensus building fails. Now, as to fostering convergence, I think that if we look at the many, shall we say, episodes and milestones along the process of institutional reform since European political cooperation and certainly Maastricht onwards, this idea of institutions creating the conditions for convergence has been a very important driver. It is a question of maximizing the added value that institutions can bring to member states to deliver those, shall we say, public goods that without common institutions may not be available. Pooled expertise, pooled information, pooled assessments, an integrated approach, a whole of the union approach, a critical mass by bringing resources together. These are public goods in the making of EU foreign policy. Institutions may not have delivered them to the full extent in that environment, in that context where the implementation of Lisbon has taken place, and for a number of reasons that we don't really have time now to address. But what I'm saying is that there is a potential to foster these dimensions of institutions delivering services, added value and goods to member states on these and other accounts, which, by the way, is particularly fitting the sort of the international agenda that we're seeing, because when we speak of geoeconomic threats, when we speak of hybrid threats, of course, the separation between diplomacy, economics, and security has to be overcome through a larger strategic, more integrated approach. But even if the institutions were to fully deliver this sort of goods, this sort of services to member states, still member states may not be on the same page at the same time, and preferably at the right time. Institutions cannot force that. And so how to deal with dissent? And of course, in the debate, there are two ways, and you mentioned them, QMB and differentiated cooperation. Now, on QMB, I have a slightly different take. I mean, clearly there are downsides that have to be recognized and debated in terms of exposing divisions among member states, in terms of alienating potentially some member states. But it seems to me that the benefits outweigh these concerns. First, because QMB is not necessarily there to be used. It can provide a push towards compromise, or at the very least, to the use of constructive abstention, which you rightly mentioned as a potential way of dealing with dissent. And secondly, because if some countries decide to remain in a minority, I don't think that it is the use of majority voting that sort of alienates these countries. It is because these countries have already taken a political decision of being happy with being singled out and perhaps using that politically also to defy others. So I don't think that majority voting necessarily contributes to alienating countries. But okay, this is a larger debate. There are indeed pros and cons. The broader point is that I don't think that the time for QMB is now, for the simple reason that I don't think that there is a unanimity in favor of introducing QMB. And therefore, we remain with differentiated cooperation. There are treaty provisions. Constructive abstention is one, enhanced cooperation, we all know, never used except once for constructive abstention. There are other provisions, Article 44 on the implementation of CSDP tasks, interesting. But so far, differentiated cooperation has taken place informally through a variety of formats and frameworks, lead groups, contact groups, regional initiatives, and so on and so forth. Now, on a rather ad hoc basis, one may say, I don't think that differentiated cooperation is necessarily a quick fix to the challenges and problems that face more cohesion, more coherence, more convergence in foreign policy. Considering that, of course, the roots of these problems, as I tried to say, are deeply political and touch upon issues of increasing political silence. However, I think that not least in the context that is taking shape in the larger evolution of the, as I said, political context of the Union in response to a more demanding strategic concept, differentiated cooperation can be seen and can be used as an approach that can help convergence, or at the very least can help manage differences in ways that are not disruptive. Even though without enjoying the contribution, the commitment of countries that decide not to take part. There are, of course, a set of requirements that we can draw from experience to ensure, or at least to enable, differentiated cooperation to not only enhance an effective European foreign policy, but also perhaps to generate over time convergence. I am out of time. Of course, one is the fact, an explicit reference to the larger goals of EU foreign policy is spelled out not only in the treaties, but in conclusions of the European Council, conclusion of the Foreign Affairs Council. So rules from member states which define the core goals of their actions consistently in line with these larger goals of EU foreign policy. Close consultation with the HRVP and with EU bodies, whether by receiving a task or anyway by consulting on defining the goals of the, shall we say, lead group or the contact group. Consideration of how this action interplays and interacts with other aspects of EU external action, whether it is sanctions, whether it is agreements, whether it is incentives. Very important, all of these aspects to come together to be mutually reinforcing. Being open to other member states, prepared to seriously engage on the basis of the same goals and propositions. One could continue, but all I want to say is that, yes, differentiated cooperation can be one way, not a magic one, not a quick fix, but can be one way of addressing some of the problems that you have identified alongside, I think, a strengthening of the institutional center of gravity in that capacity of providing information, expertise, intelligent assessment, integrated approach, because I think that that is even more evidently necessary today than it was up to until a few years ago to enable an effective European foreign policy and to inform a shared strategic culture. I conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni, and again, thank you to both of you for already presenting maybe different, but certainly complementary assessment analysis of these the challenges we face in the formulation of foreign policy. I can tell you, judging by the many comments and questions on the thread of the chat, it has stirred quite of a debate, and we will move to that. And I'd just like to maybe interject and with a few consideration on when it comes to sort of bringing together the member states, at least on building a common assessment of the challenges and the risk we face, maybe the starting point of building a strategic culture. And I can only refer to the process that has been undertaken in the context of the strategic compass, which started by I would say, unique joint work with the member states on developing a common assessment of risk and threats faced by the EU. And so at least building the sense of what are, from the different capitals, the sense of what are the threats and challenges we face. And I think one could argue, even expand, that building this common assessment is maybe the first step in building any strategic culture. Also, maybe just to point also for the sake of illustration that there has been some dynamics and within the remit of the Lisbon Treaty, using the Gymnich increasingly as a steering entity, also with a role of a presidency, to debate informally. So you could argue it is a sort of an hybrid between the pre-Lisbon Treaty and the current Lisbon Treaty. There's been also recourse to the use of some member states' foreign ministers as EU envoy, as the foreign minister of Finland towards the crisis in Sudan. So there is space, so to say, to develop within the existing institutional framework, albeit with all the caveats and elements that you flagged, Professor Smith. And of course, there are other questions as to do with assuming we have the common assessment and we have the common will to act, is the question, do we have enough, the right instruments and the toolbox to exert all this, which is, if you look also from this angle, you may see that there have been some progress with instruments that increase the resilience and the clout, not just the sanctions, the different new regimes of sanctions, but the screening of foreign investment, the instrument to fight against the coercive, economic coercive attitude. So if I had to summarize, and maybe echoing what Giovanni said, in a way, e pur si muove, to quote Galileo Galilei, there is something, but there are the constraints that Professor Smith underlined. So let me go through some of the questions I would try to lump together. And there are different questions that relate to I would say the dynamics around the member states, and I will quote a few questions directed to you, Professor Smith. One from Nico Kepers, another one from Kacik in the EU delegation in Argentina, and I think maybe from Lars Schumann as well. One has to do with the production of the common position. So what you describe as the lowest common denominator, is it the worst version of what is usually described as a compromise at the level of the EU. How come member states have agreed in the first place to relinquish power and responsibility in the Lisbon Treaty if one considers all the downsides you described? And as part of the more looking forward of how the member states could maybe work together through this differentiated cooperation, if they were not acting, what is your take on this idea of a European Security Council? So that's for Professor Smith, but of course, Giovanni, if you have complementary reactions to that, feel free. So I will stop here for the first round of question. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, all right, thank you. And thank you, Giovanni, for your comments. I mean, I'd just say on the strategic external context is important. They don't necessarily lead to a common response. And I think some of the comments we've seen about the absence of the European Union in vis-a-vis Russia and the Ukraine crisis, I think are an illustration of some of the difficulties that I think are still there. I also would have an issue with differentiated integration because I think there would linkage politics would play. Who decides whether or not EU sanctions are going to be applied and so on. I mean, I think there are questions that we could certainly discuss there. In terms of the questions that have come from listeners, I think the production of common positions is the lowest common denominator version of a compromise. In other words, it disappoints everybody except for the country that is holding out for the lowest common denominator. The neo-functionalists used to say what the Commission is trying to do is to upgrade the common interest. In other words, to go to a much more median point amongst the preferences. But a lowest common denominator would be pleasing essentially only one or a small group of states and leaving everyone else relatively unhappy. Why did the member states agree to relinquish so much power in the Lisbon Treaty? I think is an excellent question. I'm not entirely certain people thought things through, frankly. I do remember in the discussions leading up to the Lisbon Treaty, I raised several times whether it was a good idea to get rid of the presidency. But everyone was focused on the disadvantages of the presidency, only every 6 months, who speaks for Europe, and so on and so forth. I think we're now, a decade later, and we still have some of the same questions: who speaks for Europe? On the European Security Council idea, I mean, I assume this is sort of this idea to try to figure out some way of cooperating with the United Kingdom. On security issues and possibly also Russia, though I would assume that's off the table for the moment. In terms, I certainly think that it would require a massive change here in London, frankly, in terms of deciding on closer cooperation with the European Union on foreign policy issues, but it's got to be coming. I mean, it's inevitable that, the values that are, well, one assumes the values that are still shared across the channel, the kind of the geostrategic position and so on, all would point towards stronger cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union on foreign policy and security issues. I think we will get there. I don't know how long that will take. But to that end, I mean, whether creating yet another institutional format for that is the right way, or whether trying to do this it's got to be done in a different way, certainly to the way that cooperation is organized with, say, a Norway or a Turkey. I think the UK is in a different kind of category there. So possibly, but for the moment, I can't see the UK engaging with that kind of, this particular UK government engaging with those kinds of ideas. So I hope that's addressed some of those questions. Okay.
Thank you. Giovanni, any additional thoughts on this?
Yes, just very briefly, as to member states relinquishing power with the Treaty of Lisbon. I mean, yes, the treaty abolished the rotating presidency and sort of strengthened the institutional center of gravity, if you like. This was one goal. But let us not forget that the part of the thinking behind this, I think I remember, was to try and maximize the interconnection between the EU level and the national level. Let us not forget that, after all, the European External Action Service includes both EU officials and national diplomats. Now, we can discuss at length the way in which this experiment, this hybrid body has taken shape and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the idea was there not to separate the two levels, but to bring them as structurally together as possible. Now, this is very difficult. It is also unprecedented. It is certainly the case that sort of some of the ideas needed a testing of reality to then be improved in the way they are implemented and so on and so forth. But I wouldn't say that the Treaty of Lisbon was primarily about sort of sidelining member states, because I don't think that anybody has really thought that there could be a CFSP without the member states. The question was how to strengthen the capacity of, if you like, common institutions to bring member states together. And I think that some of the difficulties that this experiment has faced are due to the specifics of institutional reform. But I think that a bigger part of the explanation is, once again, the political and larger strategic context where this implementation has taken shape and the type of pressures that it has put on member states and national leaderships. Let us not forget, after all, that before Lisbon was entered into force, when the Union has been confronted with a sort of serious shocks or geopolitical crises that are today much more present, much more frequent, such as back then the Balkans in the 90s or the Iraq crisis in 2003, the supposedly stronger engagement of member states in EU foreign policy has not necessarily resulted in common positions being taken in a timely and effective fashion. The contrary may be argued. Therefore, institutions are part of the explanation, but up to a point. As to the European Security Council idea, I think it is important to think of a way of having an informal structure, as Karen said, not necessarily very institutionalized, to maintain the structured dialogue with the UK, when the UK will be happy to have this structured dialogue. I am not sure that this would necessarily be the ultimate solution to overcome differences, including among the largest member states and others more or less rotating. The differences, as we have said, require time to address. I think that a sort of European Security Council that should be thought of is the idea of creating something that brings together, once again, expertise across different sectors. And therefore, the reference goes rather towards a national security council than an intergovernmental additional European Security Council.
Thank you. Another series of questions, and again, I will lump them together and to both of you, revolve basically around the new kid on the block resulting from Lisbon Treaty, and which was supposed to be one of the I'd say an engineer of European common foreign policy, which is no less than the EEAS. And so there was a question from Peter Smith van Gelder to both of you. What is your take on Vimon's report on EEAS? From self-doubt to self-assurance. It's basically a comment on, after 10 years of existence, where do you think the EEAS stand? Has it failed its mission? Has it been failed by the member states? Linked to that, there was a question also about this ability of the EEAS to bring a European common culture. The presence of national diplomats within the EEAS, has it been a success or not? Special questions. So there was also a question by Kenny Bell, and there were some remarks from Desi Shumilova and others on the specific role of EU delegation in forging a common European position, where probably the the sense was that maybe out there inside the country, it's easier to make a European common foreign security policy than at HQ. I will leave it there just for your reaction, and there is I will go for another round of questions. I've collected a few already. So who wants to start on this? And maybe Giovanni to start on this one of the EEAS at 10. What has worked, what has not worked, what we should do. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, look, I mean, as I said before, the EEAS was and is an experiment, and it is an unprecedented one. Producing foreign policy in an interinstitutional environment, in an intergovernmental context. Easier said than done. Clearly, there have been shortcomings. Clearly, there have been different identities, not always mixing up as fast as it could have been expected or hoped for. Clearly, there have been expectations by member states, sometimes countervailing expectations, not necessarily fulfilled. But because of the fact that they are countervailing, they are also different to fulfill as a whole. And clearly, there has been the introduction of the EEAS in a pretty crowded institutional environment, with a number of actors looking at external action. Of course, the Commission, the Parliament with its prerogatives, the Secretariat of the Council, and aspects of external action, which incidentally, in the last 10 years, have become more central to external action, have become much more intertwined with strategic affairs, and therefore require really that kind of structural interface that the EEAS and the Commission are supposed to provide. Now, has that been delivered? Has that been done to the extent that we can hope for, as the textbook would suggest? Arguably no, and I think that there is a certain understanding of that. Is that a good enough reason to question the exercise and the direction of the logic that has informed the creation of the EEAS? In my view, no, but there is a need to improve. Improvement takes a stronger performance, including across institutions, to really work on the same page and therefore deliver more added value to member states. But it also takes the openness of the member states to receive an input that has to be a strong and timely input, which is not going to be always to the liking 100% of all countries, because it has to be an input that brings together a number of instances, a number of preferences. So that is essentially my overall sense, and there are, of course, a number of proposals, including in that report, to improve the functioning of the EEAS. The role of delegations, I think the performance of EU delegation has long been considered one of the positive aspects of the experience of the EEAS, and for clear reasons. I don't think there is a need to go too much in depth on that, but of course, to the extent that delegations not only serve as a one face to represent the Union, but also contribute to that unity and integration of analysis, information, expertise, and assessment that is then delivered at headquarters level. To that extent, of course, they perform a very important role. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Smith.
Yes, thank you. I'm not going to add much to what Giovanni just said about the external action service based in Brussels. I mean, effectively, I agree, unprecedented experiment, and which has had its ups and downs in the past decade. However, I would simply bring to the table what I have learned about the performance and the problems of the EU delegations in New York and Geneva to the United Nations. And there, that was a very different picture. Now, I've published this, so it's all out there. But just what I understand is that the EU delegations in both Geneva and New York have not been able to improve on the kinds of outputs that the EU member states had previously agreed. In other words, there hasn't been a step change in terms of what the EU, I'm talking about the area of human rights, I would say. So this is UN General Assembly Third Committee, Human Rights Council, and it has been much more difficult for the EU delegations to stay on top of the constant in Geneva on human rights, it's constant. I mean, there's almost no break in terms of it was difficult for the EU delegation to stay on top of that. But we have also not seen the EU delegation bring innovation or more Europe, I think, more European Union to the UN. So I don't know about the performance of the EU delegations. I'll take Giovanni elsewhere. I'll take Giovanni at face value, but certainly at New York and Geneva, I think it's not quite that kind of a story. It's a much more nuanced story.
Thank you very much. Just to echo some of the comments in the chats, it seems that in some places the EU delegations are uniquely placed because not all member states are this, and has probably more means and power of convening power and also leverages, whether through the political importance it represents in terms of development cooperation and other or trade or economic cooperation. So thus giving a leverage, but probably what you said with respect to the UN and international organization is also a reality check on the degree of when the member states have real big stakes, where the limitations to the EU on capacity. Third round of questions, and probably the last, looking at the time. There are two sets here, actually. One set of questions, there was from Nico Keppens and Alar Oldrum, regarding the sort of the again more in the institutional setup, what is the experience of the PSC as a sort of a place for the socialization of foreign policy and still expression of by the treaty where they have a sort of guidance on the foreign policy, and there has been again an experience. But also linked to that, the role of the European Council, which by treaty is the place where the strategic direction, including on foreign policy, should be given. And so the question is there any space for a so-called Team Europe approach in foreign policy? So that's one set of questions to both of you. And the second, again, to both of you, as more it's a citizen's perspective. What would talk to the citizen in terms of EU foreign policy? What will make the difference for the citizens in terms of recognizing the EU as an actor of foreign policy? And David Thorm at the Belgian embassy in the UK also highlight the notions of conveying the ideals and convey the values. And I would just put a footnote to that there is indeed the Conference of the Future of Europe process, and one of the basket is of the 5 baskets is about EU role in the world, and there is an interaction with the citizens. So, what do you think would be the distinctive added value that the EU could bring to the European citizen in the area of foreign policy? So, back to you on these two topics and 2 sets of questions. Maybe starting with Professor Smith this time.
Sure, thank you, Hervé. On citizens, I hate to be completely and utterly cynical, but I'm not sure that citizens are aware of what their national foreign policies do. In other words, there's lots of literature, academic literature out there on how rarely citizens think about foreign issues or foreign policy issues. So there's a broad issue there. So that within that kind of perspective, whether the EU would get a look in is of course another question. What would make citizens recognize the EU as an important actor? I mean, I think it's quite clear here that on trade they would. It's a double-edged sword there on whether trade brings the kinds of benefits or imposes costs on citizens. In terms of climate change, it again can recognize the EU there. In terms of foreign policy in general, I mean, I think I would guess I would have my doubts in the midst of a crisis, of an actual existential foreign policy crisis, which we hopefully will not see, e.g., invasion of Europe or something like that. I think then it would matter, but I'm just not entirely certain that citizens pay that much. I mean, a subset, a very small percentage of citizens do, but they're going to be aware of the EU anyway, because they're reading newspapers the newspapers that carry stories about the European Union. So I would have my doubts there, but I certainly would say that for that subset of citizens that cares about what the EU does, I do think that for a subset of them, for some of them, interests are going to matter more. So, what is the EU bringing me in terms of protecting security or standing up to X, dictator or whatever. And then for another subset, it will be about value. Is the EU acting in line with what I consider to be the values that it should be acting in line with? But that's, of course, also a double-edged sword. So on that perspective, I'm not sure that there would be anything that the EU that would make a difference to recognize the EU as an important actor. I think it's much more important for the EU to work on what the citizens of other countries think about the European Union, and whether the citizens of other countries recognize the European Union as a foreign policy actor, or as an actor who could provide security, provide benefits, work together as a partner with their country, and so on. I think I think those are the citizens that should get more attention. In terms of the institutional setup, one would assume, that the Political and Security Committee is almost a kind of a perfect example of how you could foster more socialization compared to the political committee before it. Because the political committee before it was what I tell my students is decentralized. In other words, you had the political directors in the national capitals that came together, say maybe once a month or whatever, maybe a little bit more frequently in the later stages of the political committee, but they came together and then they went back home. The Political and Security Committee is permanent, based in Brussels, meets much more frequently. That socialization committee is in fact a place that you could see socialization. But I did just see a this morning or yesterday morning that Coreper is now getting the files on foreign policy before PSC. I don't know, that bureaucratic stuff that goes on, bureaucratic politics that goes on naturally. I mean, in a university, there's a lot of bureaucratic politics in a university. But I would certainly argue the PSC would be an ideal. That's the kind of thing that could lead to more socialization, simply because of they're meeting each other more often. At least twice a week, and are based in the same geographical location. As for the role of the European Council, but the poor foreign ministers are stuck in the middle. They've got, what are they doing for their job? They've got the heads of state above them, and then the PSC ambassadors below them, and where are they? Which has been actually pointed out by some academics, a bit squeezed there. The role of the European Council, yes, and this comes back to what Giovanni was saying initially. Yes, there's been a kind of a crisis dealing with a variety of crises, and we've seen this written about, before, and that becomes the site. The European Council becomes a site in which the politics of dealing with these various crises happen. But just in terms of the day-to-day stuff that it has to happen on foreign policy, can't happen at the level of European Council, because that can only set, broad guidelines and strategic direction. It can't necessarily decide on the ins and outs of stuff that might have to happen on a much more regular basis. So there has been a trend for prime ministers and presidents to kind of take over the dossier of foreign ministers. That's been a long-standing trend, with foreign ministers desperate to try to figure out how to make themselves relevant. I mean, this is not just, I'm not thinking Europe. There is a much wider issue here about the role in terms of setting foreign policy. But so the role of the European Council, I think, maybe on broad strategic, it doesn't have that kind of capacity. It's not that institution for that purpose. I'll hand over to Giovanni now.
Yes, thank you. Well, concerning the European Council, I agree with you. Clearly, it is not necessarily well suited as a crisis response body unless it is convened for those purposes. It has actually performed as a crisis response body in the course of the Eurozone crisis and in the course of the migration crisis. Whether it can perform a similar role in the context of a very serious, pressing, imminent, clear and present threat, so to speak, coming from the outside, I think it could, conceivably. And it would also be probably in the presence of that order of magnitude or challenge, the right body to mobilize. Because that responsibility, again, needs to be taken by national leaders. But again, on a normal basis, entirely correct, it is not necessarily the body that can follow the specifics. At the same time, however, the European Council is where different agendas come together and connect. And if it is correct to say that the distinction between diplomacy, security, economy, and other sectors is less relevant because everything has become a matter of more political relevance or more strategic salience, then the place where member states can come together and devise, push for common plans across the board or approve common plans across the board, well, that is the European Council actually to a large extent prepared by all the other configurations. So I think the European Council can have an important role to play in this larger grand strategic game, shall we say, that probably needs to be played. Now, concerning the citizens, well, if we look at the Eurobarometer Classic, 99%, not 99%, but the vast majority of European citizens wish Europe to do more on the international stage. The question is what? And then I agree with Karen that probably different people would have very different priorities or persuasions depending on where they live in and depending on their personal convictions. But there is a point which is clearly, it seems to me, debated, which is the gap between the sort of challenges that are coming our way and the governance capacity to respond to those challenges, and the sense of insecurity that results from this gap, if not even resentment, if not political turbulence and polarization, and so on and so forth, something that I mentioned before. Now, to the extent that this deficit and this gap exists, arguably, including in terms of proportionality and subsidiarity, the EU level of action is not the only level of action, is not always the best level of action, but most of the time is an important one to face that sort of challenges, to contribute to a protection of the EU, which, as we know, is not supposed to equate protectionism, but the ability to strengthen the resilience. And therefore, also the security of the citizens personal, economic, social identity, and so on and so forth, consistently with EU values. Difficult. This context is difficult, is testing any country and the EU, of course. But in terms of what citizens might expect from the EU, I think that this is going to be a very important test of credibility in the eyes of the citizens. And this is why it is so important for the EU to be able to create the capacity and the ability for convergence among member states to face these sort of challenges, because I think that that is what most citizens across the Union would expect. When it comes to those citizens who have a particular idealistic and normative reading of international affairs and would like the Union to project values, to be a champion of liberal democratic values, and so on and so forth, I think there should be a message for those citizens as well, something to be debated, including in the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is that advancing those values should remain a priority of the EU. The context that we are facing eludes probably full consistency in advancing these values, but a requirement to do that is a certain amount of strength, a certain power basis. Because in the new environment, the normative and soft power of the Union cannot really be advanced fully in the absence of the sufficient resources to do so, to sort of punch its weight in a more competitive environment. So this could also be one way of connecting the central, in my view, discourse on the normative power of Europe and the place and role of values on this agenda, which is and should remain distinctive of the EU, and where the EU has been oftentimes, and member states of the EU, more inconsistent than they should, with the requirement for empowering this normative agenda in new means. And European foreign policy comes into play from this standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanni. Thank you to both of you, Professor Smith and Professor Grady, and Giovanni. It was a very, very dynamic exchange, and I did not do justice to all questions. There were a few more, but for lack of time, we did not pick them up on the coordination, on Team Europe, and other things. I take from this discussion today that probably we are at a sort of paroxystic situation where, on the one hand, the sort of the institutional reality brings to bear all the tensions and all the limitations of, for lack of ownership and member states' own resistance, which have also to do with internal domestic politics, and there may be greater factors of divergence than convergence linked to that. But at the same time, the strategic landscape, as you mentioned it, Giovanni, what I call the big stakes that push us as member states and the EU to have to act together, because there is no other way. And I would simply conclude by saying that about 3-4 years ago, where at least from where I sit in the strategic policy planning, we started to sort of reflect and socialize a bit among member states the concept of European strategic autonomy. It was a bit of an outline thinking. And it's very interesting that over time, now there is less and less dispute about the need for increasing European resilience and capacity and freedom of action, even though it's still fraught with certain ideology, whether we should have a sort of European strategic autonomy as the label of all what we do. But in substance, there is a lot that has been taken. So we may be in a situation, actually, what I call the paroxystic situation, is that on the trends to work together of convergence as probably as strong today as the strength or the forces that pull us apart. And so that may be the reason why it's so difficult these days to go through. But those crises, and maybe Europe is a bit asleep on the switch, or that some will criticize that too late, too slow, and so on. At the same time, we still managed to pull together the threads. And it's interesting to see that member states actually very much look forward to the EEAS and the Commission to come together with policy papers that can guide discussions, frame the issues, and for them, of course, to deliberate. So I think very much is also lies as much as in the process, the quality of the process, than whatever the institutional setup. And I think this is the realizations of those past years. So with this, I think we are just at 18:31. I think we are reaching the time of closing this session. I just want to say a word on the next session, which will take place on the 7th of February, under the title "Reckoned with: Asserting Europe's Distinctive Power in the Multipolar World." So it's what I just say is a segue to this session, which will be introduced by Professor Vivier, the Perpetual Secretary of the Royal Academy of Belgium of Science, and with a lecture by Ambassador Hubert Védrine, the former French foreign minister, and by Rosa Balfour, who is the director of Carnegie Europe. So please book that and pencil that in your agendas on the 7th of February. With that, I will conclude, and thank you again very much for your attentions, and first and foremost to our speakers today. And we really enjoy your thoughtful insights, your provocative thoughts, and I think this is after all what it's all about, to push our own reflection. So if we leave the discussions with more questions than answers, it's probably a good sign in a way. So it forces us to continue to reflect. Thank you for this, Karen and Giovanni. Have a good evening, and bye-bye to all.